16th, 1993, and we are very privileged this afternoon to have a family of former servicemen who represent perhaps the largest number of people in one family who served in World War II. I think we'd like in Montgomery County, yes. And Bob Wernle, of course, is the manager of this group of these films, and he's done quite a few of the interviews. But we thought we would trade around and ask questions and perhaps introduce the men and let them say their piece. But we'll ask one of them to tell about their family and how many boys there were and so on. Did you do that?
Who's going to start?
Well,
let's introduce him first.
All right. Well, why don't you introduce yourself?
All right.
And give your where you are, where you're living now, and
I'm Harold. I'm age 75. I live in Darlington. I've been in Montgomery County my entire life, other than the war.
I'm Lloyd, and I live here in Cromersville, Twin Oaks, and I'm 74 years old and lived here all my life in Montgomery County.
I'm Wally. I'm 72. I too, a native of Montgomery County. I live north of Crawfordsville, just a short distance.
I'm Donald. I'm age 70, and I live in Carmel, Indiana. But however, I was a native of Montgomery County until 1971, I guess.
I'm John. I'm 66. I've lived in Montgomery County all my life.
I'm Ernie. I'm 64 years old, and I've lived in Montgomery County all my life.
Marion, we ought to mention that the Vaught family is having a family reunion this weekend.
Oh, great.
And where is the family reunion to be at?
Lake Holiday.
Lake Holiday. And how many members are going to assemble for this thing?
3 years ago, there were 100 and some appeared at that reunion, both in-laws and our immediate family. I don't know the exact number that pertains to our family, but
I imagine there are a few more than 100 this time.
yes, I do. Well, there were a few missing that time, maybe 15 or 20.
I might add that this is just descendants of our father and mother, and it's in the high 70s, 80 or 90 every time we meet, and they're not all there.
Why don't you tell us about your parents and where they live and so on?
Well, they lived out on the corner of Oak and Pike Streets, 1015 East Pike. Well, during War II, that's what. Did you want to start?
Begin.
Well, in the very beginning, it was my father was a railroad foreman in Newmarket, Indiana.
What was your father's name?
Wallace L.
Wallace, okay.
And my mother's name was Marie, M-A-R-I-E.
And her maiden name?
She was a Fritz.
Fritz.
Yes. And she was a Park County girl. And my father married her in 1911 and had the first boy in 1913. That's our oldest brother, who's still living but was not a veteran.
Now, we've missed him and we've introduced all of you. There are others here. There are others that are missing today. Why don't you mention those?
The veterans or the family?
Both.
Both. Well, my mother and father had 14 boys and no girls. 11 of us grew to maturity. 2 or 3 died in embassy. So, Wilson is the oldest. I'm next. Then Lloyd. Then Wally. Don. Then Bob is in Nashville, Tennessee. He's not here today. And Jim is deceased, and he was a War II veteran. Then John. Then Ernie.
Who is now commander of the local Legion post, right?
Yes, he's the local. And Raymond is deceased, and he was a National Guardsman too during the Korean conflict.
You missed Edwin.
Edwin. Okay, I'm sorry. Edwin is the youngest at the time.
He's 54.
He's 54, and he was in the National Guards during the Korean War.
Changed at 56.
Okay.
Now, you said your dad was a railroad man. What railroad did he work for?
It was in Pennsylvania, and he was...
So you lived out right near the...
Yes, Oak and Pike in Crawfordsville, but we started in Newmarket because there was a railroad section gang every 7 miles on the track from Frankfort to Terre Haute. So, and in the Depression days, 1935, as a matter of fact, we moved to Crawfordsville on January 1, 35. I was a senior in high school at the time. The rest of the boys finished in Crawfordsville. My oldest brother and I finished in Newmarket because that was the basis of the family beginning.
Well, tell us about, let's come up to World War II now, how each of you got into the service and why you chose it, or were you drafted, or what? Can you tell us?
Well, I'll start out. I was
Yes.
number one, but Brother Wally here and I went up to, as I recall, up in Canada in early September, or maybe it was August of 41, tried to get in the RAF.
Oh,
And they were going to give us 90 days training, have us over there fighting the Germans. So we come back and decided that was a little bit too quick. So at that point, I decided to go into the Army Air Corps. So I was the first one to service. I went in September of 41. Army Air Corps.
that was brand new Army Air Force too, wasn't it? Because I can remember when they changed over, I did physical examination on the first guys that went into the Air Force.
And
Army Air.
I went through my basic training and I moved several bases and finally ended up overseas, 15th Air Force in Italy. After the war, went then to South America and spent about 8-9 months and came home.
Tell us about, what did your parents think about you running off to Canada to try to get the service?
They didn't know about it. We went to Canada for a weekend to have a good time, and while I was up there, we thought it'd be a great idea to join the RAF. And it's our CAF.
RCA.
And when they mentioned, why, sure, we'll sign you up in 90 days, you'll be flying sergeants, and we looked at each other and said, a guy could get killed in this business. I came back home.
So you were both Air Force stayed in the Air Force the whole time?
I was the second one in. I was drafted in the summer of 1942, and I can recall when we boarded the train down here at the Big Four stations, now Crawford grocery store, and there was a lot of people around. It was on Labor Day, the day I left. It was quite an interesting thing. It was sadness and it was happiness. You know, people. There was a whole train full of veterans that came through from Peoria and right through, and just kept loading us on and went to Indianapolis. But at that time, it didn't seem like there was too much worry and concern. The war hadn't really taken a serious turn yet. We were just, you know, the Japs were beating us every place we went. So,
Good. Well, did you go stay with the Air Force, or were you Army?
well, it's in the Army, but I was assigned to the Army Air Corps. It was known then, and I took all my training in the Air Corps, and then finally, before the war over, I think they finally called us Air Force. But
Did you have your physicals induction at Fort Harrison?
Fort Bend.
Yes.
What did you do in the Air Force?
I was a mechanic. I was good and always have been good with pencils and numbers and things like that. So they made me a mechanic, showed me how to use wrenches. And I spent 44 months, and I came
You
out.
got sent overseas?
I spent short terms only in Havana, Cuba. That was not considered overseas duty. And but
You wouldn't now, wouldn't you?
yes. But anyhow, it was you know, it's quite a privilege to serve, really, and a lot of friends and buddies didn't come back, but you know, that's the way it happened. But
When did you get out of the service?
December 15, 1945.
It's the same day I got it.
How about that?
I got out to 14.
Did you?
What about you, Don?
Okay, Harold was next.
I was next, and I was drafted, and I left Crawfordsville, Indiana one morning in November and did not return. That was November 42, and did not return until August 45. Almost 3 years, but I was in the United States for about 3 months, shifting around doing basic training. I was in the Air, they assigned me to the Air Force, and I left one day when my wife called me to California, incidentally, and got pregnant. So I have a little girl I didn't see till she was 16 months old, little baby girl. And I went to England. I was in London, about 70 miles north of London, for 26 months.
What was your job?
and I was in the post office, of all things. However, I took schooling, but I took schooling in Los Angeles in a clerical for the Air Force, and when they got me overseas, they didn't need me in the office, so they assigned me to the post office. And we had a base of 2,000 people, just a repair base for B-17s.
What was the name of the place?
Where I was?
Yeah.
2nd Strategic Air Depot.
It was near what town?
It was near Huntington, the home of Oliver Cromwell.
Was it Stoughton there, they sold her?
Pardon me?
Stoughton?
That was the first one.
Oh.
That was just a few months of stuff. And so nevertheless, I was there 26 months, just 70 miles north of London, and spent many a weekend in London seeing the sights and so on.
What about the air raids? Did you see all that?
I saw a number of them. A buddy of mine from Indianapolis, we were in a theater watching a Bing Crosby movie downtown London one night when they had the last big raid, and there were 200 German bombers came over, and we went out in the street to watch our Air Force shoot them down, and they made us go underground. They had underground railroads there, and but we did see some of them shot down, and that was the last big raid they had in London.
When would that have been?
1944, the spring of 44, I do believe.
Mm-hmm.
Battle of Britain, that was the end of that, huh?
Yes, yes, that was the end of that.
Well, we got 3 Air Force men. Do we have anybody else? What was your nervous?
Quartermaster.
Rear quarter, armor.
Listen, these guys survived on what we were doing. Baking bread and roasting coffee.
I don't know. I wonder if you guys shortchanged us on that canned bacon. We never did see that.
We had all of the good things.
That's what I know.
Yeah. We had access to quartermaster.
Well, Don, why don't you go ahead and...
Go ahead and tell about it.
Well, if I can remember that far back, like my brother Harold, they drafted him, and then they went on down the list and discovered I'd been in school too long, so they drafted me the 1st of February of 1943. Like the other boys, I reported to New York Central Station with dozens and dozens of others of my classmates here in Montgomery County, over to Fort Harrison, where that was the induction center. There 5 days by troop train, 5 days and 5 nights to Seattle or to Vancouver, Washington. And along that train was 1,060 of us, made up of Indiana, Ohio, and Kentucky, and that comprised the 615th Quartermaster Bakery Battalion. From that point, we spent 5 months there and was through basic and brought back to Camp Sutton, North Carolina, in June, I think it was, of 1943. And of course, I managed to furlough so I could get home, get married, thinking this might help me. Believe it or not, it did in the end. My wife got pregnant during that short period of time because I was aboard a ship 6 weeks after we were married, which was on July 7th, 1943. Went to England from there. There we broke the bakery battalions down. For each company there were 2 companies and of just about 110 men. And our job was to supply the front lines with the bread and the coffee. That's solely our existence. You might be interested to know, though, that as many brothers as there were circulating around the world in World War II, I managed to run into my brother Harold just about 20-some miles down the road when he was over at the air base, because we were stationed at Kettering, England, not far from Northampton. Later on, I ran into my brother Jim, who was a field artillery, and the one's deceased now. And he was in Germany, and that was before the war was over, and I think we met around Hanau, Germany. He showed up with $1 million, $2 million in a duffel bag, none of which was good. They got it out of the bank that they destroyed during the Third Army's approach to Germany. And anyway, Jim and I got to see each other quite often until I left Germany in November of 45. I, like the others, got home and discharged on December the 1st, 1945. They were a little behind me getting out of the Army.
But how close to the front lines did you get? You said you were spotted.
Early on, we had at Omaha 16 plus D-Day set up, and I thought that was the end, but it wasn't. And we were still trying to break out of St. Lo at that time. We stayed within about 6 to 8 mile of the front line all the time. The big guns fired over us constantly. They were always behind us firing the 240s, and some 105s weren't that far away because of the infiltration of Germans in the hedgerows of Normandy. I did not see combat. I would not have been here if I had seen combat. It took brave souls to do that. And,
A few of us survived. But
what I said,
we did appreciate your service. Don't think I will say this: the quartermaster corps did a tremendous job getting everybody fed and controlled.
I might tell you, we baked 35,000 pounds of bread a day, made the crust hard enough to survive the weather. We took the paper sacks and trucked it right to the front lines, within a mile or two of where they could have access.
Did you have field bakeries?
Big camps like a circus, and mobile units all
They
over.
were in camp?
Yeah, we were under a huge camp, just like a big circus camp, and we had four, today we call them 4 huge trailers, 4-wheel trailers, and there the ovens were on those. And we, as I recall, we used diesel fuel for the purpose of the baking. We had huge mixers on those trailers, and we also roasted coffee, about 25,000 to 30,000 pounds, I suppose, a day. Just supplied. We were just one unit. There were many of us over there in that same area.
How big a group of people did you bake for? How many people did you serve?
Well, we were attached to the First Army first, and I don't know if breaking it down to battalions how we were doing it, because we were hauling it in just to one supply base, and there the infantry was sending trucks back to pick it up and take it right up to the front line for them. We were too close for comfort. As a matter of fact, I recall vividly the situation involving the day that we sent the hundreds and hundreds of planes to bomb as we were trying to get out of St. Lo, and the skies were black that day, totally, for all types of aircraft flying in from England to do the bombing. You could hear them. We were that close that you could hear feel the concussion of it on there.
My 4th Division went on Utah Beach, which was much easier, as you know, than Omaha. But I'm sure we must have got some bread from you people, because we never wanted for bread.
Well, I remember one incident. You might be interested in listening to this. General Patton come ashore with his 3rd Army out of England. And we were not far away from that depot, and it proudly announced that they should get all the damn supplies off the road so he could bring his tanks ashore, because he was anxious to get going. And literally, that's what he did say, and that's what he did do.
Hey, John, go ahead.
Bob, someone should maybe include Bob and Jim in this.
I wanted to mention that to Bob. We actually saw Bob over there too.
Well, why don't you talk for Bob? You met Bob over there.
Well, one of you boys may know a little more about his airborne. He was 82nd Airborne. Robert's about a year and a half younger than I.
When did he go in?
I can't be sure that John might be able to answer better.
Spring of 43, I thought.
I was thinking spring.
I think that's fairly accurate.
I have a little knowledge of him because we visited while he was in a hospital in Liverpool, England, after he had some kind of a disease. He didn't get injured. He was a paratrooper. He jumped in both Italy and France. Italy was the beginning, and then later Sicily first.
France,
And then he went into France, but he didn't get injured, he got sick, and they brought him back to Liverpool, England, to a hospital. So I got a week's furlough and went up and visited him there.
Did he have a hernia or appendectomy or something?
I'm not sure what it was.
Matter of fact, he was jumping 7 days after that.
Yes.
And then Bob fought with the 82nd Airborne Division, and let's see, 517.
Yes, 517.
Parachute Entry Regiment while he was with.
He was in the Battle of Bastogne, I recall. Matter of fact, he was on.
Well, no, he was in the Battle of the Bulge.
Or Battle of
He was in the hospital, and they pulled them all out of the hospital and went and fought the battle.
He said they counted their shell or counted their ammunition, that it was such a severe circumstance for them when they were trapped with the Germans. I recall him saying that General McNaughton had a lot of nerve to speak for him when he said, "Nuts, come and get us," because he said there wasn't too many of them left up there at that time.
They held.
Yeah, they did.
There was something that I missed that I'd like to inject
No,
here,
go ahead.
if I may,
Please do.
about my experience. I want to say that when I went overseas, I went on the Queen Elizabeth, 22,000 troops, all men, no women. And it took us 4 days and 4 nights to get to Scotland. And I came back on the Queen Mary, and there were 15,000 of us on the Queen Mary coming back. So I traveled both ways on the two largest ships the United States owned.
There must have been nurses.
Well, there may have been. So then one other thing I want to inject is that this place where I was in the post office was a strategic air depot which repaired B-17s coming back from the flights each day from Germany. And they'd fly down to and we were a repair base, and they'd fly in and drop flags if they had injured aboard. And they'd come in with one or two props sometimes, and holes in their wings and all of that. So we did see actually the results of their action.
That song coming in on the wing of prayer was straight
Yes,
stuff.
it was indeed.
I was up at Harold's Base on one occasion, one of those 17s was coming in, these wheels up to land out there on the,
Yes,
side.
yeah. It was quite an experience. I forgot to mention that.
Now you were going to interject. You were covering the fellow who was in the air, in the parachute.
Parachute bomb.
Okay.
Then Brother Jim is deceased, and he went in 43, I believe, wasn't it?
I think mid-43.
In 43, and he went through his training.
He was an artillery, he went to Fort Sill, Oklahoma,
Yes.
and he was an artilleryman, and from there he went to parachute school, then he didn't complete the parachute training, then they sent him overseas, and I think he was with artillery.
Third Army. That's how I met him.
Armored artillery. And he was in an invasion across the Rhine and so forth, and ended up spending time in the
Occupation.
Army of Occupation.
Occupation.
Played with the Big Red Division football team.
And then along with that, he was later, he stayed in he was in the Guards, and then the Air Force Reserves, and then he deserted the Air Force Reserves, and went into the artillery again in the Korean War, and was overseas. When I was called back to service in 51, the colonel says, Vaught, James A. Didn't answer, and finally, Vaught, Lloyd E. He says, where's James A? And I says, he's over in Korea. He said, good riddance.
Well, you know, you said he deserted. He sure didn't desert there. Well, they may have changed, but
He
no
changed
desertion.
He turned to the Air Force. So.
Yeah, okay.
He decided on a spur of a moment, I can have I think it's a master sergeant's rating in the artillery, and that's where his experience was. And I think he left Camp Atterbury, no, it's Columbus down there.
Yeah, at their Air Force Base.
And went to some corps down in Louisiana and joined the artillery, and within 2 weeks, I believe, he was shipped over to Korea and had a lot of combat duty over there in Korea.
Now,
John, you guys,
John.
My name is John. I dropped out of the civilian life at the age of 17. June, I decided not to go back to school. I told my dad I wanted to join the service, and I said I want to join the Navy. And he said, well, if that's what you want to do, very much I can do to stop you. And that was a common thing to do then. Whether you were graduating out of high school, the death rate coming back in all the newspapers, our friends, our neighbors, many of them. So it was just not unusual when you were ready and able, you took up the sword and went yourself. And I felt with 6 brothers in that I should go, and I wanted to go, but I chose the Navy, and I went to Great Lakes in June the 10th of 1944, and the first week of September the first week of September I was on the United States aircraft carrier, Admiralty Islands, heading out across the Pacific. And we traveled for 6 solid weeks without ever seeing land again until we landed in Australia. We had a slow convoy, but it was a long route around to dodge Japanese submarines. And then I stayed at Ley in New Guinea then for a week or so, and then I went to the Admiralty Islands, stayed another week or so at a naval replacement depot, and then I went aboard ship, and we went to the Philippines for a very short stay to pick up a convoy. And then we went, we took this convoy and went to the invasion of Iwo Jima. And we were there for a couple of weeks. And while that island was being secured, some of my more memorable moments, one day we were ordered to go north of Iwo Jima to pick up B-29 down pilots that never made it back for mechanical difficulties or injuries due to the anti-aircraft over Tokyo. But in any event, one clear day there, we were 40 miles north of Iwo, and we made a run at flank speed for an hour or so, and there was a B-29 floating on top of the water. And that was almost unbelievable. But they simply had run into strong headwinds coming back on a Tokyo raid. And fuel tanks empty, they simply set it down on a glass sea. You could almost say it skated on it. And all of them were out on the wings. Some of them were taking sun baths, and a couple of them were playing catch with the ball. Nonchalant, just as cool as they could be. And so we took them aboard and then took 20 millimeter and ripped their tanks open, and the plane sank. And then from there we went back to the Philippines and picked up a tremendous convoy of, as I remember, 800-900 ships and brought them to Okinawa. And I stayed there until my war ended there. On May the 13th, we got hit by a Japanese suicide plane north of Okinawa, between Okinawa and Honshu. And I was on a gun crew of 9 men, and there was only 2 of us left. And 2 weeks later, I think, perhaps, when I got my bearings, I was in the Army hospital overlooking the B-29 strip at Saipan. And that was it for me. I never forgot, you never thought about the enormous air power that we had in the Pacific. But General LeMay then was a colonel, full bird colonel then, and he was in charge of the B-29s on Saipan. And those B-29s would start taking off at noon, every day, just as regular as clockwork. The last B-29 would leave that runway at 11:30 at night, and the first one coming back from Tokyo would land at 12 o'clock, just a half hour later. And this went on and around the clock. That's how many B-29s they had on that island. It's just amazing.
That is interesting. We don't get too much information about how much air power we put over Japan, but there was a tremendous amount of it.
Oh, it was something else. Even over, many times over Okinawa, the skies, and the Iwo Jima too, the skies absolutely were just filled with you can look up anytime and see not just dozens, hundreds, whole wings off. Bunker Hill or the Saratoga or others, all of them, you could recognize their markings as they headed for Okinawa. And you realize there had to be 40 or 50 carriers out there somewhere, with somewhere of 100 to 120 planes each. And that's just a lot of stuff. Yeah. One time we watched a dogfight that occurred right up over us, around 25,000 feet. And we never fired a shot. And yet planes were just coming and going down in flames and smoke all around us and splashing in the ocean fairly close to us. And a Douglas Dauntless dive bomber had come in, and he was smoking. And the sky was real smooth that day, and he come in, and he just come down alongside our ship, and he just dragged his tail in the water, and that plane just slowly settled down, stood on its nose, settled back in the water, and he just as nonchalantly reached up and slid the canopy back and undid this hitch and undid that one, stepped out on the wing, stood there with his hands on his hips. Now, these guys were cool customers. he was shot all to pieces, and not only that, he shouldn't have even been in a dogfight. He'd been on a bombing run somewhere and just happened to come back and intercepted these Jap planes coming back. So that's how he got.
This kamikaze that hit your ship, you say it exploded where on the deck then? And
There were 14 of them that come in at us just about a half hour before dark. This was a very common thing. The day before we got hit, May the 12th, we were at radar picket 13. Radar picket 14 was the closest to 75 miles north of Okinawa. It was the very closest to Honshu Island. And these destroyers were spaced at 45 to 50 mile intervals apart. A whole complete ring around that island as radar. That was the eyes for the fleet and the Army and the Navy and everybody knowing what the Japs were throwing at us. And even when that Jap, the Yamamoto, come out for its last voyage, we were at that area at the time it came out, and of course the fleet intercepted it long before it ever got down there with us. But we were at radar picket 13 the day on May the 12th, and the radio come over that the destroyer had been sunk on radar picket 14, so we made a mad dash that night. It was dark, well after dark when we got there. And the captain come on, he said, "Now all hands hear this. There are no bogeys within 75 miles. Open all hatches, turn on every conceivable light we've got, get these men out of the water, get them out of here fast." Well, what we didn't know, we could hear these men lying there quiet in the water, but the minute we turned on our lights, the sharks were just absolutely having a field day. One survivor told me out of 350 men on that ship, we got 179. He said, the suicide plane hit him right at the water line in the forward engine room, which wouldn't have killed over 8 or 10 or 12 men. The sharks got the rest. And we stood there on the quarter deck, and my job was just to reach down and grab these guys as they come up the ladder. We had 3 or 4 ladders over. One big strong man come up, he grabbed that ladder and come up out of that water, and just as he come up waist high, a shark grabbed him, and that shark, the boatswain mate told me later, he said that shark was every bit of possibly 18 feet long and 3 feet in diameter. He took that whole man in his mouth at the waist. He screamed and fell back, and when he did, the second shark got him, and that's, we had everything we could get in the water to get those men out, but we had, any Navy man will tell you at Okinawa, you had more to fear from the sharks than you did the Japs, because if you got in the water, you were in deep, deep trouble.
Did you ever, John, did you ever hear Adrian Marks tell that story about rescuing when the Indianapolis was sunk?
Yeah, I read that too.
And those guys were floating around there, and sharks were coming after them.
But in any event, then on May the 13th, then we took over where that ship was sunk, and we stayed there that night.
Now, what ship was that?
I was on the United States Destroyer Beige, a DD 470, 2,100-ton Fletcher class destroyer. Very modern ship then.
Now, what ship had been sunk?
I don't recall the name of that ship. I did at the time, and I did for several years after that. But at that time, I didn't. Since then, I have forgotten, and I might have somewhere in some of my memorabilia, I might have that, I don't know. But anyway, it's 6:30, getting near 7 o'clock that following evening. 14 Japanese suicide planes come right out of the sky. They'd come in at 12 o'clock, they'd come in at 3 o'clock, they come in just above the water, 20 feet. That caused you to split all your guns up to try to track the different targets. Well, we did a very respectable job because we had 5 single 5-inch mounts in addition to all of our 40 millimeters. But we got all but 2. One hit our forecastle, cut the lifelines, so we lost both anchors, and the other, it just died right straight down in our boiler room, the forward boiler room, and that was it.
How old were you when all this was happening?
18. I was just 18. I was just 18. Just turned 18.
That's tough for.
I was lucky.
How are you wounded, John?
I had a piece of shrapnel go through here and tore out part of my left tonsil, and they put me in a cast, and I went to the Brooklyn Naval Hospital.
I was interested
Several months later, and they cut the cast off and took it, because it laid right against my spine. It was as big as in your thumb. It was just.
I was interested in what you felt about the medical care that you got.
It was very, very good. Those Navy hospital ships were just tops. They were just as clean as any hospital operating room anywhere, and not only that, they had the best people. Yeah. There was, the Army had your mud and your tents, and they operated out in the environment. But then those hospital ships are absolutely first class. You got it. Yeah, they were.
And that's where you awakened in the hospital, Navy ship.
I remember going into Aishima on a small boat, and I went aboard a hospital ship at Aishima, and Ernie Pyle was killed there the next day. I remember that. And then they transferred me again, and then I didn't remember too much until a week and a half later, and I was on the Army hospital site.
I've seen Ernie's grave there at the Punch Bowl Cemetery in Hawaii. He was brought from Hiroshima to be reburied there.
I laid beside a Marine that he had a beautiful Japanese samurai sword. And I asked him how he got his, and he said, well, the day that Ernie Pyle was killed, he said, our company was working up a group of ravines on Aishima, and he said the Japs had us pinned down. The ravine was like 100 feet deep on both sides, and he said they had foxholes dug everywhere up in there, or in the cliffs. And he said they just had us pinned down, and our orders was to secure that entire area. So he said they had us pinned down there for 3 days, and he said every morning about daybreak, a fat Jap major would come out of a cave down there, just out of sight and still dark enough you couldn't see him, and American Marines, today you die, banzai, banzai. And he said this went on for 3 days, and he said, so the 4th day he pulled that crap. He said, I told the sergeant, I said, you won't see me tonight now, I'll be back in the morning. He said, I crawled on my belly all night long, just a few inches at a time. And he said, I knew I had to be close to that sucker when he come out. He said, the next morning, sure enough, he'd come out, and there he stood just 25 feet above me. And he said, I just took myself, Thompson cut him in half, and he fell at my feet, and I got his sword, but I got it too. He said, then the whole outfit come up through that. He said, that's what they needed, just something that...
That's some story.
Yeah, I wish I could have, of course, I was with a lot of these people that, just like the kid, I'm very fortunate to be here myself, the kid by the name of Brzezinski out of Chicago. He was a little short fella. He was 5 feet 4 or 5, and he had, on our twin 40 miller mount, he had the pointer's job, and that's a wheel you turn. And if you lose your electricity, which radar controls all firepower, but if you lose that, you go to manual control, and that's it. So the pointer takes the gun up and down, and the trainer on the opposite side moves the gun this way. And he said to me, he said, one day, he said, I talked to the gun captain, he said, and I'm so short, I can't lift this ammunition up to the first loader, he said, and he said, it'd be perfectly all right with me if you trade with me. And I said, sure, I'll do that. So he took this seat where I sat as a pointer, and I took the first loader's position. Well, he got his head cut clear off right here. And that was just 3 days later. In fact, I lifted him out of the seat and put him down on the deck, and I thought, boy, I would have been decapitated, because that's exactly
You're tall, right?
Yeah. It was just one of those freak things that happened.
John, what's your feeling toward the Japanese now? Is that all healed, or you still got it?
Oh, there was a time of bitterness, like anybody else. I lost a lot of my friends, but there were 41 on our ship killed, and out of 3 of them, I was on there for almost 2 years, start to stop, and then I went back on the ship, put out of commission, but 41 were killed and 32 were wounded, and most of the wounded never came back. So I know at the time that a young boy he was a signalman on the bridge, and when I got up off the deck, there was just me and the gun captain left, and I don't know where this boy come from, but I do know he was a signalman on the bridge, and he had both his legs blown off at his knees, and he lay there and he said, help me, Vaught. Well, I took my shoestrings out, and the kid from the gun crew on the port side had come over, and he too took his belt out, our shoestrings, and we tied both his knees off, and that's the way we left him.
But he survived?
Yes, he did. And at that point in time, there's a lot of profanity when you throw caution to the wind when that kind of stuff goes on. I used to have trouble sleeping at night, even being a young man. You finally get your belly full of it, but I stayed on my gun one time off Okinawa for 5 straight days and never left that gun except to go to the restroom, or the head. They bring us sandwiches, dirty, stinking, wet, cold, and all you did is just throw the ammunition in the gun. It's just as fast as you could throw it in there.
Did you have plenty of ammunition?
Oh yeah, but we take on ammunition every 2 or 3 days. We just couldn't hold that.
You had supply ships that were bringing stuff to you.
It was not uncommon for us to tie up alongside a cruiser. Well, we never tied up. You always went on a run. You just didn't stop. But to pull up alongside a cruiser 150 feet away, and the tow lines and the baskets come over with ammo, and to replenish our supplies, and of course, using the same small caliber guns they used, so it's no problem. But and fuel oil, diesel fuel, the same thing. Just run full time, full bore. Everywhere you went full bore. Everywhere. It was interesting. I recall in Madison, the Admiralty Islands, there the parts of the 5th Fleet had been as a scrap of the Jap fleet, and they came in there and they mustered all the hands from the labor pools there to get down and start loading the boats. And a heavy cruiser, Salt Lake City, come in. It was smoking, and its whole bow was blown away. And a couple of the destroyers were smoking and shot up and leaning in the water, listing, and They just come in long enough to grab ammunition, supplies, and right back out. They never even dropped anchors back out because they were tangled with the Jap fleet out there around, at that time, as they did around the New Britain Islands. But that's interesting. I think about that.
That was pretty far down south, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Because the Admiralties are way down there toward our state.
It sounded like you got the bloody word.
Well, I am a sheriff.
You sure did.
There is something that might be of interest here in that you mentioned about the large fleets of planes and, and the things that happen. And earlier I mentioned I was a mechanic. I was in a training command. And just like we build bombers at Willow Run, and I was at Willow Run watching the B-24s come off as I finished school on the bombers. But just like we built bombers around the clock, they had lots of plants, then they had a lot of air bases in the stateside and overseas, but I was only stateside, where you trained these pilots for combat. And it was around the clock, 7 days a week, 3 shifts, and it was nothing uncommon for the ground crews to work 12-hour days. They worked 2 shifts, but everybody else flew 3 shifts. There was a tremendous toll on planes. We lost planes 2 and 3 at a time in the same day from training accidents, because you were taking 18 to 20-year-old young men fresh out of flying school and putting them in a huge 4-engine bomber and trying to do this. And of course you had all sorts of accidents, you had all sorts of losses, wear and tear. You just wore out planes within a matter of months. You'd wear out planes and you replenish them, send what's left off the repair depot just to fix. But the logistics of training for a war, like there's combat things, was just unbelievable.
Where was Willow Run? Is that in Michigan?
Ypsilanti, Michigan.
Ford.
Yes, but that was just one of about 5 B-24 plants. There were 5 or 6 B-17 plants. I ended up working on B-29s, and there were 3 of those. But our industrial capacity was the key to so many things, because we just turned it out by the hundreds, on a daily basis. And they were used up.
If we all had the enthusiasm that everybody had in those days, wouldn't we all be better?
Yes.
I tell you, we could be proud of those days. We really can. For all of the civilians that worked so hard, as well as the service people,
That's right.
Well, John, is that the end of your story?
Oh, I go on all day and all night, but that pretty much covers me, I think. I remember a lot of different incidents that are interesting, but that really wouldn't have much bearing.
Well, we may have to have a special deal for you folks.
Bob, there's something I want to mention now. This is for Montgomery County. In our unit throughout the entire war, I had a lot of Montgomery County boys in my unit, which I thought was unusual. Francis Henry Wingate was one of them. He and I...
Who was that?
Francis Henry.
Francis Henry.
Played for Wingate's basketball team, 41. He was in my tent from the word go all the way through the war. The only time we were separated, but I returned home just 5 days ahead of him at the end of the war. We were overseas on 28 months over Europe. Saw 5 campaigns throughout that time, from England to all through France, Germany, Belgium, Holland, up in that generation. But I want to mention it because there were a lot of Montgomery County boys in it. Raymond Strong was another one. He was in Raymond Strong.
Very strong, yeah.
He was in Company C. Jack Moore from Crawfordsville was in Company C. Jack Fisher from New Ross was in Company B. We had a lot of them. I would guess maybe at least 50 out of Montgomery County throughout our battalion. The boys that we stayed together until they split us up overseas.
Now, we go from John. Is there somebody in between?
No, me. I'm Ernie, and I enjoyed I didn't enjoy the World War II experiences. What I did enjoy was I guess the proud of having all these older brothers in service. Now, I missed World War II, and I was still in Crawfordsville High School. And I think I really was disappointed that I missed the war, because John was just older than me, and he had been a decorated veteran and so forth. And so secretly, I think I was really disappointed that the war ended. And anyway, I finished high school, and in 1947, I joined the National Guard. And I hated it. I really hated it. And I thought, well, there's only one way to get out of this, and that's to join the Army. So in September 1947, I did join the Army, and I went to, took my training, basic training in Fort Knox, Kentucky. Then I went into the paratroops, and I took my jump school training in Fort Benning, Georgia. From there, I joined the 82nd Airborne Division, and I stayed with the 82nd Airborne Division for 3 years at Fort Bragg. Then the Korean War came along, so here I'm going to get my time with war, I thought. And so in 52 is when I first got to do that. In 1952, I went to Seattle, Washington, and I went to Japan. And then I joined the 187th Airborne Regimental Combat Team in Korea. And I saw action there in Korea, and from July 1952 through, I was in 2 different campaigns, from July 52 up to the winter campaign, and then we went back to Japan that winter. And in the spring of 53, we went back to Korea again. And the reason we went back at that time was because the North Korean troops they were still talking about the armistice then, but the North Koreans weren't showing a whole lot of enthusiasm for it, so they started putting pressure on the Korean troops, or ROKs they were called. And so we went back to bolster the ROK forces, and stayed there. I stayed there until the armistice was signed in July of 1953.
What was your, were you in the infantry or what?
I was in the infantry. When I first got to, I was in the infantry at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, with the 82nd Airborne Division, with the 504th Airborne Infantry Regiment. And then I went to a division headquarters assignment. Then when I went to Korea, I was with the 3rd Battalion and the 187th Regimental Combat Team for my first action in Korea. After that, I went back to regimental headquarters.
How close to the Yellow River did you get?
Well, we didn't get, at that time, the action was back at 38th parallel, and we never did cross the 38th parallel after that.
Did you do a combat jump?
No, I didn't do a combat jump. We were prepared for one in the spring of 53, when all this action, when we'd gone back over to Korea from Japan. The Marines, there was a planned Marine assault on Wonsan Harbor, and there was going to be a joint Marine assault and airborne drop. And I think we were in a marshalling area, had our full combat loads, the planes were there, were ready to load up. About 1:30 in the morning, they called it off. We were supposed to drop at daybreak, so we were pretty close. And I know this, we were sweating it out. I'll never get General Westmoreland. At that time, General Westmoreland was our regimental commander, and he was a full colonel. And he got promoted to brigadier general just after that. But I remember at about 1:30 in the morning, when some of us were drinking coffee and trying to get a little bit of sleep, you know, and we had our parachutes and everything just laying around ready to load into the planes. And they turned on brought these 3/4-ton trucks and Jeeps up there, and General Westmoreland, or Colonel Westmoreland at the time, got on the Jeep hood and announced to everybody that told us what where we had been going, and that they called it off. And you talk about a celebration, we had a celebration then. All of us knew what, that was not going to be an easy thing. And but then the armistice was signed in July 53, and that was the end of it. Now, I was there for till September or October, and then I went back to Japan. And then, of course, came home in November of 1953.
Did you stay in the Army then after that?
No, I didn't. I spent a total of 6 years and 4 months in the Army, because I'd gone in 1947, and I had 20 days to go before the Korean War started. Well, not quite. The Korean War started in June or July, I think it was, of 1950. I had saved some lead time and had planned to get out of the Army in August of 1950. And 20 days, I think it was, before I was going to get out. And then they said, they stopped all discharges and said everybody had to stay in, you know.
They extended your
Yeah,
duty.
extended it for 1 year. And then after they extended that 1 year, I just went ahead and re-enlisted, I think, the following December. Wished that I hadn't afterwards, because the following year I could have gotten out.
What was the reaction of the troops when MacArthur was relieved?
Most of them thought that Truman was completely gone bonkers. Yeah, I'll never forget that. We thought, you know, how could a president do something like this, you know?
In the carpet.
And so we were pretty disappointed. And overseas, even people still talked about that 2 years later. They still talked about the thing.
You were an aide to General Westmoreland, weren't you?
Yeah, I finally, I was going to say that when General Westmoreland, or when Colonel Westmoreland made general, he was one of the youngest brigadier generals in the Army at that time. And I think he was 38 years old when he made brigadier. And so we went back to Japan, and I had gone to school. I'd learned how to be a stenographer.
What?
Stenographer.
Oh.
I'd taken shorthand, and the general was authorized a stenographer. And so they scanned the regimental records, and I'm the only guy in there who's ever done anything like that. So they called me up and asked me if I wanted to be a stenographer for him and stay at regimental headquarters. And I said, sure, that'd be great. And I ended up, I went from private to a master sergeant in my 6 years. And,
You were stenographer for Westmoreland?
yes.
You got to know him pretty well, huh?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I really did. In fact, I corresponded with him after I'd left the service. Then I decided to, I was offered a direct commission in the National Guard in 1956. And so I wrote him for a letter of recommendation. And he sent me one. And I was commissioned then, second lieutenant, and finally ended up as major, retired from the National Guard as major. But I served with Westmoreland, well, let's see, a little over a year during that time, which I was his personal secretary. And afterwards, he sent me a picture of him, and said best wishes to Ernie, a man that I've served with during this period of time. So I was very proud of that.
How did you like Westmoreland?
Well, I thought he was a great officer. I can remember one time in Fort Bragg, we were on a training jump, and I'd been injured, my knee had been injured, and we had completed our tactical mission, and I crawled under, it was raining, and I crawled under a Jeep trailer, and the medics had taken care of me, but they couldn't evacuate me at that time. And I suppose sometime around midnight, some officer came around and he found out I was under this trailer. And he came over there and asked me questions, how I was feeling and this and that, and if there was anything he could do for me. And it turned out to be Colonel Westmore. So I had a lot of contact with him. He didn't know me from Adam, but I remembered that this was a guy that, an officer who cared enough at midnight to go around checking on people that had been injured in the jump. And so then later, being assigned in his regiment and becoming a stenographer, secretary, I was pretty proud of it.
When's the last time you had any contact with him?
I think it was about 7 years ago was the last contact I had with him. I was up at Purdue University. He was up there after the Vietnam War. He was speaking at Purdue. And Myrna and I, my wife Myrna and I went up there and we met him after his speaking. And he took us back into a reception room. And the press was back there and so forth. And he said, I want you to know this guy right here was my secretary, served with me in Korea with the 82nd Airborne Division. So it really made me proud.
Well, you should.
And then, like I said, he sent me this picture of him. He was full-star general at the time.
Well, Ernie, you stayed in the reserves. Well, it seems to me, I remember we had meetings together some way. I can remember.
Yeah,
you were.
Yeah, see, I was in the National Guard time when I knew you, when you were in the reserves after World War II.
Yeah.
And so I stayed with this battalion out here, the 139th Field Artillery Battalion.
Yeah, okay.
For my 23 years, I think it was.
Well, listen, you know, one thing when we started out, we're going to say something about the folks at home. Why didn't somebody tell something about it, who was there when all these fellows were getting into the service, and they must have been pretty nervous about everybody going in there.
Let me address part of that, if you would. Having been at home during all this time, I can recall Dad so many days would come home, and the first thing he would ask about is,
Who's going in today?
well, yeah, and who did we get letters from today? And the ones that, particularly after the invasion of Europe and so forth, it was Bob or Don or Jim or whoever, you know. And if there was no mail, he was a very sad person. And he and Mom both listened to the news every night.
Well, you would be the only one at home then.
Well, me and my younger brother Raymond and my youngest brother Edwin, there was three of us still at home at that time. And going to school, of course. But that's some of the most enjoyable times was when they would, someone would come home on leave. Oh, that was quite an occasion. You know, the mom would go out and find some of her neighborhood friends and get some of the rationing stamps for additional sugar so she could make some pies.
Red stamps for
Yeah,
me.
right. And different ones, even me, I would go out amongst my high school friends and try to get gasoline stamps so they could have some gas to put running around while I was on leave. But I do remember a lot of times that Dad and Mom both, they just, well, the only thing they lived for was those letters, or to be heard from the boys that they were safe. And
You must have been getting a flood of mail with all those.
well, yeah, they must, there was an ungodly amount of mail, and most of it was V-mail. I don't know whether very many people even remember what a V-mail letter is, but most of the letters.
My mother kept all the ones that I said. I'm going to try to go through all that stuff before I get too old.
My wife has, I think, all of that I wrote to her from overseas. That's all, almost all female.
Yeah.
So I doubt the children today would understand it, but they wouldn't know.
Yeah, they don't. I've showed my grandson, what's a V-mail? I said, well, here it is, right here. So
You know, I still have some of my savings bond stamps.
Oh,
I had a book in high school. We had a goal in our class, the different classes of high school, to contribute so much money each week or each month, I think it was. And I still got some of my little books with savings stamps in them.
still good.
Yeah, they're still good. I'm holding on to them until the interest rates get high.
Something of interest, of course, I stayed in reserves after 1945, and I was recalled to active duty back in the reserves, and went into Korean War, and I went back in May of '51, and ran into Ernie, Houston paratroopers. I was a troop carrier at that time, and we were on maneuvers at the same time, and got together quite a bit, and Ernie couldn't fly on my plane though after the.
Yeah, I tried to get linked up with him so that I could be jump from one of the planes that he was attending, and I couldn't do it. But Don Akers and some other gentlemen here from Crawfordsville who were reservists back on duty then. I did get on some airplanes, and it would not be uncommon as we went out the door to yell at him or wave at him as we went out there.
He'd be flying on my left wing or right wing, and the doors open back there, and we could yell over. Of course, you couldn't hear us, but you could see each other.
You know, in June of '40, when the Korean conflict, I was sweating it out too because I was still in the reserve. Fortunately, they didn't call my unit, but they could have.
Well, I wondered about that, how you missed the Korean War, because I do know a lot of World War II doctors and so
Well,
forth.
they just didn't call my unit.
I got called that.
Well, you know, I made 61 parachute jumps in my 6 years that I was in paratroops, but I think back, when I was a youngster, I think I wanted to be a paratrooper, and I wonder sometimes, I'm not even sure I knew what a paratrooper was. I knew Brother Bob was one during World War II, but gosh, I used to climb trees, jump out of trees, jump off boxcars and things like that, and I thought, one of these days I'm going to be a paratrooper. And by gosh, I made it. I made it.
Doctor, Kirtley and Bob. Harold didn't mention, but there were 6 of us, 6 or 7 of us in the National Guards after the war, the beginning of the time that they put the Guard Division together here in Crawfordsville. As I said, I don't think anybody mentioned it.
Well, that 6 of you the same unit.
Yes.
That's one.
Harold, Lloyd, Wally, myself,
No,
I stayed in reserve.
and
But
Bob,
I was in it.
Jim,
Yeah, Jim.
and Edwin, and Raymond.
Who was said that their child was 20 months old?
I'm 16. Let me say that I wanted to say something else here just for a moment about family. We were a very close-knit family, and I'm next to the oldest in the family, so I saw all of them grow up behind me, and when I left home, I didn't get back for 3 years, almost 3 years, like a month or so. From the time I left Crawfordsville, I didn't get back to Crawfordsville for 3 years. And my little kid brother, who I dearly loved, was 5, and he was 8 when I got back. This summer, yes. When I last saw him, next saw him, he was 8. And those are memories that, kind of touch you a little.
Yeah. Well, my son, I didn't get to see until he was over a year old.
Yeah.
He was conceived in Florida,
Yes.
and we went overseas right after that.
My daughter was 16 months old. My daughter was 16 months old. And Don had a daughter born just 3 months after mine.
How many of you were married when you went into service? Were you?
Just Don and I.
I got married during
No, during service.
Okay, I
I
was.
borrowed your car, as a matter of fact, when I come home. One furlough to get married.
But I was the only one that was married when I was drafted. And I had no children at the time. My first
How
wife.
many of you were drafted?
I was.
I was.
Well, Lloyd was the only
I
one,
was the only listener.
and Ernie enlisted, right?
I enlisted.
Yeah, so Lloyd and Ernie enlisted.
I thought you listened. Oh,
Was Bob, did Bob enlist?
yes.
I think he did.
I think Bob
He
did.
really
John
wanted
did.
to get
John
drafted.
did.
so-
Yeah.
John
And Jim
Bob-
too, I think he
I
enlisted.
think Jim did too. I think.
I think
I'm just-
the youngers began to enlist.
I was gone, but I think.
I'm just sorry that our deceased brother Jim
The
didn't
old
get
desire
drafted.
to get in. They want to get in.
They want to be a part of it.
Let's get this on the tape. We're getting too much.
I'm just sorry that our deceased brother James isn't here to relate some of his stories from overseas during World War II, but most of all, our brother Bob, and perhaps you'll have a later opportunity to talk with him, because he was in several of the important battles out of Europe with the airborne people.
Doctor, you mentioned a while ago was what I felt about the Japanese or the bitterness. I never thought about that one way or the other, but wars and the atrocities that are connected with wars. Think today and then the way they were in World War II. For instance, Calley, wasn't it Lieutenant Calley in Vietnam? They brought back here to court-martial. I can recall many times in the Philippines that the officers on our ships, it's on the bridge, would take out their Colt 45s and shoot Japs in the water and laugh and chuckle and make bets on it, and steam slowly right on through them. And anybody else that wanted to take a shot at them, it was open season, no regrets. That's just part of it. And even seeing the Filipinos in their outrigger canoes on a smooth sea, 3-4 miles off Leyte, with machetes. The man in the head end of the outrigger's got a machete, and they row and he slices their heads off. That's the shark.
Japanese, you mean?
Oh yeah. Well, they hate them, and we weren't much better. Our officers, you didn't bother to pick them up. You just shot them. And if they were jabbering or holding their hands up, that was all the more reason to shoot them. We just didn't bother to pick them up. No one did. But nowadays, think what they would do to you for that.
Yeah,
Well, but
court-martial.
they wouldn't have been saved if
No.
they were going to drown anyway.
You couldn't trust them. They would have a hand grenade under their arm or they were fanatics. All of them were fanatics.
Brother Bob said over in Europe during the airborne advancement, once we got away from Bastogne, the Battle of Bulge, that there was numerous occasion that they used to have the interrogated, took them over the hill and shot them. That was the result of the Malmedy ordeal where they lined all our troops up.
I went by that Malmedy place. We saw those helmets lying right there in the snow.
We were in Verdun, France during that time, Marion, and Bastogne, of course, wasn't that far from us with the Battle of the Bulge. And some of our people were brought out of our company and put into the infantry to race up there. As a matter of fact, that was widespread all over the
You
area.
know, von Rundstedt had got into Spa, a little Belgium.
Yes.
There were 5 miles of jerry cans full of gasoline, and he got within 5 miles of that. If it had that gasoline, it had been right on his
Oh,
bed.
yeah. They come close to
Sure
They come off the front.
I saw those jerry cans sitting there on that road. I know they were there.
Let's, you fellas ever go back, you've got your family reunions. You ever go back to any reunions of your outfits?
Brother Bob did. Brother Bob still does.
Still every year.
He's gone back to Europe and looked over some of the drop zones that he dropped into and places where he fought in France and Germany, and he's done that 2 or
Was
3
he in the
times.
82nd too?
Yes.
And when you went to 101st for a while? During the war?
I can't be sure whether he was attached to them or not, but as he was with a separate regimental combat team, and they moved them wherever they needed them. But basically, he was part of the 82nd Airborne Division. But I know at St. Viv, I think they took them away from the 82nd at that time and shoved them up into St. Viv when they were having a real hard time up there. So he moved around a lot and served different units. And I did the same thing in Korea. Our regimental combat team in Korea, there was only one parachute unit there, and so we would be with the 7th Division for a little while, and we'd be with the 2nd Division for a little while, just wherever we were needed. That's where they would send us.
Attached you to it.
Yeah.
Well, you know, in the Legion magazine, every month you got all these outfits that are meeting. None of you fellas ever been to any of those reunions that they mentioned in there?
I watch for hours. I haven't seen it now for years and years. But
I've been in the 4th Division several times.
I watched them over the years, and they have, my ship has a reunion, I think every 5 years, and I was going to attend one this May of this year, which would have been the first I'd ever would have attended, but I was too busy, I guess, raising my family to, and they never really ever held any reunions very close. Iowa, I think, one time was as close as they ever got. The rest of them been in New York and San Francisco and Shreveport.
I'm going to a reunion in August up in Chicago at my outfit. I went to Seattle last year. And but it's only in the last few years that people have started going to those reunions. I think more than when they first started. When you get old like we are, you begin looking back and feel those attachments of.
Well, when I was younger, I attended one of the 82nd Airborne Division Association conventions in Chicago. And it was fun, but it would be a whole lot more fun today. But for some reason, I see where they're going to have one. And I think, well, I'm going to go, maybe I'm going to go this year, and see if I can't find some old buddies. But, I don't think I'm going to meet any of those guys, so I'd say I probably won't go.
And you correspond with any of the, of course, you kept up with Westmoreland to a certain extent. Any of you correspond with fellows you were in the service with? Ever any contact with them since you've been out?
Early on, that's the only occasion. That was in the late 40s. As a matter of fact, I
40s, 50s in there. I had
3 or 4 of them. I go visit them over at Winchester, Union City.
But to this date, I still correspond with 2 of mine at Christmas time, and I have one real close buddy at Youngstown, Ohio, that I see at least annually, if not more frequently than that. But like all the other situations, the ranks are thinning. There's less and less of them to make contact with.
Yeah.
You're talking about Ernie Pyle. Ernie, I got to see Ernie Hemingway. As a matter of fact, I treated him one time for a cold. He was in Europe. Of course, he hopped around from various places, but he survived that war and 1 or 2 others later. And the story is now he committed suicide. Fine.
Ernest Hemingway?
Yeah.
Oh.
Something got to him.
Well, I think the ordeal of our parents, when I wasn't here to realize what was taking place, must have been very much restrained on them as I was telling the story. Later on, that were related to me. Father was a person that chances are was out on his section on the railroad, later at 6:30 in the morning and likely coming in at 5 in the evening. That's hard work, long hours. But he still had time to communicate with me as far as corresponding with me. I would get at least 1 or 2 letters a month, sometimes a little more. Sometimes it would be my mother that would be writing. But remember, they had 7 or 6 more that were writing too, and I'm sure they kept busy with all
They use stenographers, too.
going on to communicate with us. I can recall on one occasion at Christmas time, we were still in England then, in 43, got a big box of cookies and things that she made.
Did you get any stuff sent to you from your parents? I mean,
Yeah.
did you
Yes,
get
yes.
packages?
She must have baked a lot for us.
I never missed a birthday that I didn't get a box from home.
Birthday?
Fried chicken, tomatoes, ripe tomatoes.
Right.
Yes, as a matter of fact, one time it was sort of late when we got in off of the line from working and stopped by the PX and the beer parlor first. Got there and had a box sitting out in the dark on the barrack steps, eating fried chicken with a buddy or two. And what did Mom send me these green tomatoes for? Next day we looked at it, they weren't exactly green. It's sort of yellow, you know.
Well, I remember
She said
one,
red, yellow tomatoes.
I remember an occasion, I can't think of the gentleman's name, Mr. Tolley maybe, wasn't he the Western Union man?
Johnny.
John. Yeah, he had a Western Union office there in the Crawford Hotel. But I remember one time when he was in our neighborhood, and I remember all of us kept looking out the door, out the windows, wondering where he was going to stop. Because he was the gentleman that always delivered, he was wounded in action or killed in action.
You know, that was a terrible thing.
Oh, my. I
Send
didn't
those
realize
Western
that.
Union people out.
And when they brought, when John was wounded, I remember when they brought the telegram on that. Everybody was holding their breaths.
But I remember that, so, you know, after Jolly died, his widow ran that thing down there across it. And I remember hearing her tell when Stumpy died, Raymond Stump died. Remember? Raymond Stump was killed over there. And she lived right down there on South Grand Avenue. And Stumpy lived, no, it was Bill Leavenworth.
Yeah, Bill Leavenworth.
When Bill Leavenworth lived right up the hill from her. And when that telegram, you know, those darn things used to come in on that tape. And she read that, saw that tape coming in, and Bill Leavenworth was right up the hill there, and it announced his death. She told us a story that when she just collapsed right there on the telegraph machine to read that thing. Of course, you're going to have to deliver that. So, of course, they do it differently now, don't they? They send a chaplain out or something.
I think so.
There were so many in those days, they would run a chaplain to
Yeah,
death.
but that was you mentioned that thing on Jolly. He had a terrible job to deliver those telegrams. Well, look, we've got to get more stuff out of you. As you sat here, why don't you tell us some more things that you recall about your service?
I think we pretty well covered a lot of it.
Well, now, as you, I didn't explain this to you before, but what we're going to do with this thing is we're going to put this tape in the library. You can believe it or not, we've got about 30 of these, I don't know. We've got at least yeah, we've got 30, 35 of these tapes over in the library now. And this tape is going to be there for people to check out as they're interested. In fact, I'm sitting in the barber chair recently, and some guy said to me that he looked at he'd had all these tapes out of the library, looked at every one of them. And so I think and as time goes on, there's going to be a lot more interest in this. You know, you've seen this, there was an issue of American History magazine recently about, are we getting too late here? About the Battle of Gettysburg. 50 years after the Battle of Gettysburg, they had a reunion there. And they showed all these old codgers with whiskers and telling their stories about the battle. And we're luckier than they were because we're going to have a lot of these stories over there at the library. Anybody wants to see them. As a matter of fact, I think that Crawfordsville, as far as I know, is the only place I know of been working at this, and we've been trying to get tapes of as many representatives as we can of various types of serving and put them on record there, because in years to come, it's going to be very, very valuable stuff.
Harold, excuse me, Bob, one thing you didn't mention, I believe in 44, 45, the American Legion had made a determination that we had the largest all-boy family in the United States. For all boys, no girls.
Yes.
I believe in either 44 or 45, because I was passed on to me, some memory.
Now, there is one other point that we haven't mentioned. Ernie here, he retired out of the Army National Guard Major, Lieutenant Colonel. Now, I served 10 years in the Naval Reserve, and then in 1961 I joined the Indiana Guard Reserve, as did Wally and Lloyd and Don and Brother Jim. And all of us, Don didn't stay in too long, but all of us rose to the rank of colonel.
You were a colonel?
He was a colonel, he was a colonel, I was a colonel, Jim died a colonel. So there are four of us that were
Harold, the
over colonels.
National Guard, you were.
What were you when you came out of the active service?
I was just a fireman third class.
In fact, I had
Water
about
temperature
3 months
class.
less than 40 years military service.
That's equivalent to a staff sergeant.
Active reserve time.
You were a sergeant, weren't you? Lloyd, sergeant, I was
Well,
corporal.
I tell you, there's a lot of brass sitting there, you know?
I think that I'm looking back, there's some miracles here. We all got back alive and well. But being able, a young boy, out here, and I went in, like I say, the first one in, but here I saw all the United States, most of it. I saw part of Europe, South America, and then coming back during the Korean War, got to go up into Canada, different places, just flying every place, and
Well,
see
like
the
Wally
sights.
here, I don't doubt there's too many of us been in Cuba. You made it there.
Well, I think, you know, most of us were, of course, I was a little older and you were older, but most of us had never even been out of the United States.
Right.
Well, you know, when I went in the service, I'd been as far as Indianapolis, as far as being away from Indianapolis. And I get down to Fort Knox, Kentucky, and I ride home and tell Dad about these big mountains down there. And I learned a few years later those were foothills. But, you know,
They look
when
mountain to you.
you've been in Montgomery County all your life, something else is very big.
Those troop trains were something too. You really you got close to people when you're on a troop train.
You know, to this day, I rode troop trains in Japan and in Korea. And in Japan, I've still never figured out how in the world you go to the bathroom or go to use the john in a troop train in Japan. They're the oddest looking things, and I never did figure out, and I never did go use one. I just opened the windows and used the windows. It'd have a hole back there right in the corner of the car.
With a couple of footprints there to stick your feet in.
And they had a big board sticking up, and I never did know where the board was.
Slide it off.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because when we were taking out Rebel Devil at Nuremberg at the end of the war, and that was in late November 45, we were sent to Camp Lucky Strike, which is La Hard Friend. But to get there, we went for 40 days. We were in boxcars, and it was turning cold. We had to go to Salisbury, Austria first. And I recall I was ill, and they got the mattress aboard and put it on the cot for me, because I had just been released from the hospital with what they thought was pneumonia. And we made a stop, and I don't recall now the town, but they broke into a shed and got a stove and put it on the car, cut a hole in the wood. We had not gotten, I don't suppose, 6 miles out of the track, and the boxcar was on fire. They had a devil time getting that fire to the top of that tree. But that's how we got back to La Hard France, Camp Lucky Strike, so we could start back home.
Well, that's where I went, came home from Lucky Strike on the 3rd of July. in 1945.
I was very disappointed. I had quite a bit of money, and we were only permitted to bring back $500, as I recall.
One of the,
You couldn't swap, you couldn't sell it, you couldn't get anybody to get it for you.
first time I gone into Korea, I was in Sasebo, Japan, and there were several of us paratroopers there, and we knew we were going to this paratrooper regiment in Korea, which was already in Korea. And so I was put on a plane that night, and I suppose about 3 hours later, I was at a place called Daegu, Korea. And I didn't know at the time, but my regiment was over there in an apple orchard, about probably 3 or 4 miles from where I was. And I was walking in this hut, this Korean hut, and I passed a guy, and we both looked at one another. And I took 2 or 3 more steps, and this guy said, "Hey, aren't you a Vaught?" And I turned around and I said, "Yes, I am." This guy was a lieutenant, and I was a sergeant at the time. And I said, "Yeah, I'm a Vaught." He said, I said, "Who are you?" And he said, "I'm Ron Beeson." Now, Ron Beeson was from here in Crawfordsville.
Right.
And I hadn't seen him because he moved from Crawfordsville in 1945 or 46, went to Paris, Illinois. And he played basketball there. But here we met right then. And he said, "Where are you going?" I said, "Well, I'm going to an airborne regiment, which is around close here." And I said, "Where are you going?" And he said, "Well, I don't know, but I think I'm going to be assigned to the 8th Army headquarters, which was in Seoul, Korea at the time." And but anyway, I joined the regiment, and I think I've been in the regiment about 2 days, and we were going up one line, and we, at that time, instead of dropping us, they put us on some trains, started us up toward the front, and as we went through, I think it was Seoul, it was the most memorable impression made upon me, with these Korean troop trains coming back, or hospital trains. We were going up this track, they were coming back this track, and guys were just laying wounded everywhere. And I thought about that at that time. I thought, you read a lot of stories about the Civil War and so forth, that the wounded from the rebels or the others, and I thought, my gosh, this is something. Here I'm going up to the front, here these guys are coming back, and they're laying there on these stretchers and everything, chopped up and everything else. And it made quite an impression upon me, I know that.
You might wonder if you might be on the next train back.
Wondered about it, I'm sure I did.
Well, they used to take us across. I remember the troop train, we went all the way from the Atlantic coast to San Francisco, and the lights, they turned the lights out at night. You couldn't have any lights on the train, and the laboratories and the toilets were just terrible. I remember how sticky they got when you're all packed in on there and sleeping in the aisles and sleeping in your chairs.
Well, when they talk today about women in combat units and so forth, I cannot for the life of me imagine that. The things, when we had to use a John, we dug a hole. We just did it openly, and there was nothing there but guys to see anyway. It didn't make any difference. Whether you were enlisted men or officers or anything else, but I can't imagine having a bunch of young ladies in the same situation.
But these gals that are astronauts now, they've got a common latrine up there, I suppose. They're pretty close together.
Either that or some awfully dry pants.
Well, I think we're, Mike, how are we doing on the tape?
Well, we got about 15 minutes if you want it.
Okay.
But,
As I started to explain to you, this is going to be in the library, and this tape will be the property of the Montgomery County Historical Society. I think probably we can make a copy of it if you fellows want a copy of it. We can can we do that, Mike? We've never had that many before, but.
well, if we can find the money, we can do it.
Yeah.
We'll figure something
Well,
out.
I'd be happy to pay for one.
Well,
there ought to be one for the family anyway.
Yeah, we can have one for the family, we all can pitch in and,
yeah.
Pass it around.
Sure, that's true.
But that's been the custom. We give the fellow that who's being interviewed, give him a copy to take. We put 2 copies in the library so that they got one for a backup and one to put on lending. And that's the way way it goes, and it'll stay there from now till the tape wears out. And we certainly do appreciate you folks coming in, and
It's a great experience for me. I enjoyed it.
And this has certainly been an unusual thing for Crawfordsville to have so many fellows in the service from one family.
And willing to give it all.
Yeah.
Did.
Yeah. Yes.
And I think that's about it.